Okay, we begin a study this morning of Romans. I'm going to guess it'll take 6 months, but I always put a question mark there because I don't know how long I'll talk, but I'll go through it. And Romans has played a profound role in church history. I'm just sitting there, I'm startled seeing my brother Calvin coming in. Hey, brother. It has played a profound role in Christian history. The book or the letter was instrumental in the conversion of Augustine, who was the influential theologian from the late 4th and early 5th centuries. And it played a major role in the Protestant Reformation. The Frederick Godet, who was a 19th century New Testament scholar from the 19th century, he wrote in his commentary on Romans, he says, quote, "The Reformation was undoubtedly the work of the epistle to the Romans as well as of that to the Galatians. Indeed, Romans played a pivotal role in the life of Martin Luther, the Catholic priest who was one of the leading voices of the Reformation. And it was with regard to insight he received when studying Romans that Luther said, quote, "I felt that I was altogether born again and had entered paradise itself through open gates," end quote. And Romans likewise had a profound effect on the English reformer William Tyndale and on John Calvin, who was a Frenchman who led the Reformation in the city of Geneva. And modern scholars and expositors of Romans, they are effusive in their praise of the book. They call Romans the cathedral of the Christian faith. They describe it as one of, quote, "the most important pieces of literature in the intellectual history of Western man." So to study Romans is to study one of the deepest and richest revelations of God. That doesn't mean it's easy. Okay? Origen thought this was the hardest of Paul's books to understand. So there are a lot of gnarly things. This is just how it is. Like Peter said, there are a lot of difficult things in what Paul says. So we're going to do our best to untangle and wrestle with these things. But it's, as I said in the little note, the little promo that Jeremy read last week, if we're not blessed through the study of Romans, it's my fault, your fault, both of our faults, but it's not the book of Romans' fault. See, the book of Romans isn't on trial. We are in studying it, and we'll do the best we can to grasp it. Now, Romans, of course, was written by the Apostle Paul. You see that in Romans chapter 1, verse 1. But it was written through the hand of Tertius. You see in Romans 16:22. He's Paul's secretary or scribe. The more technical term for that is his amanuensis. So he's the one who's actually doing the penning, and we know nothing else about Tertius. This is the only time his name occurs in the New Testament. And ancient authors, they gave their secretaries varying degrees of responsibility in the composition of their works, much like a lawyer would do today with a secretary. You see, how much input would they allow them to have? Now, Paul, it seems, the language and the style of Romans is very similar to Paul's other letters. And since there's no indication that Tertius had anything to do with those letters, it makes more sense to think that Paul pretty much dictated Romans to Tertius. So he's simply writing down what Paul says. But even if Tertius had any kind of input in the wording, Paul is the author of it, right? The letter is Paul's, even in that case, by approval and adoption. He owns it, right? It's so like if I have somebody and I say, hey, here, I want you to say this and this and this, and this sums up here, and I look at it and say, okay, yeah, that's right, that's what I want to say. And then I send it out. Now, you think if somebody comes back, I get to say, well, that wasn't me? No, that was me, you see, because I sent it out. All right, so even if you think that the scribe or the secretary has anything like that, it's still the Spirit working through Paul. This is the inspired letter from Paul. Now, Tertius, you'll see that he includes a personal greeting to the readers, which may mean that he knew some of them, but not necessarily, right? He may greet them simply because he felt a bond with them as fellow Christians. I can see that and understand that. Now, Romans was written as Paul was on the back end of his third missionary journey. He tells us that he's on his way to Jerusalem. You see that in 15:25, at a time when he felt like his missionary work in the eastern provinces of the empire had been completed. Paul felt like he'd done what he needed to do in those provinces. He's now on his way back. He's on his way to Jerusalem, and he's taking to Jerusalem the collection from the churches in Macedonia and Achaia for the poor among the saints there. And you see that in Romans 15:25-27. And that corresponds, that what he's saying there. He's on his missionary journey. He's got these funds. He's heading to Jerusalem. He's going to take the contribution there. That corresponds with Acts 24:17, where after completing his third missionary journey, Paul says he arrived in Jerusalem with gifts for the poor. And after delivering the gifts to the saints in Jerusalem, Paul's plan, he tells us in Romans, his plan is to head for Spain and to visit Rome on the way to Spain. So he's got the collection, he's going to deliver it to Jerusalem, and he's thinking, after that, I'm going to go preach in Spain, but I'm going to stop in Rome and before I go to Spain. That's Paul's plan. Now, he writes the letter from the city of Corinth. I've seen one person think that it was from Cenchrea, but I think he's writing from Corinth, and that's indicated by several lines of evidence. In chapter 16, verses 1 and 2, he commends Phoebe, who's a servant of the church in Cenchrea, and that was Corinth's eastern port. And you see both of them reflected there, Corinth and Cenchrea right together. So he commends her, and she may well have been carrying the letter. And then in 16:23, he gives a greeting from Gaius, in whose house he's staying. Gaius is their host. And we know from 1 Corinthians 1:14 that one of the Christians in Corinth was named Gaius. And in chapter 16, verse 23, he also has a greeting from Erastus, who in a later letter, the later letter of 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 20, Erastus is said to have stayed in Corinth. And Paul in Romans describes Erastus as the treasurer of the city. He doesn't tell us the city, but he describes Erastus, who remained in Corinth, according to 2 Timothy. He says he's the treasurer of the city. And then there was a Latin inscription that was found in the city of Corinth referring to Erastus as aedile. It's in Latin. So it's aedile, which means the commissioner of public works of the city of Corinth. So he's sending greetings from Erastus. That certainly seems... Now that term aedile, Paul refers to him as the treasurer. The Latin phrase is aedile. It's possible that the Greek term is broad enough to encompass that Latin word aedile, or it's also possible that Erastus moved up after Romans was written. Now, that's possible. Romans 16:21 has greetings from Timothy and Sosipater, both of whom are included in Acts chapter 20, verse 4, as being with Paul when Paul left Greece en route to Jerusalem. So all of these things say that Paul is writing from Corinth here on the backside of his third missionary journey. And all of that fits with Acts chapter 20, verses 2 and 3 as the time of the writing, where it says when he'd gone through those regions, he'd given them much encouragement. He came to Greece. There he spent 3 months. So Paul is concluding his third missionary journey there in Acts 20. He's staying in Greece for 3 months, which almost certainly means Corinth, because Corinth was the capital of the province, and Paul had a deep connection with the church there. So here is when I'm convinced Paul is in Greece, he's in Corinth. This is when he's writing to the Christians in Rome. In Acts chapter 20, verses 2 and 3, we can date when that is. Okay, so now I'm convinced we know where Paul is when he's writing Romans. Now, what's the date of it? And we can date Acts 20 verses 2 and 3 because we can do that from Acts 18:12, okay, which says, has Paul in Corinth while Gallio was proconsul of Achaia. So we have that point. Paul is in Corinth, 18:12, when Gallio is proconsul of Achaia, and there's an inscription from Delphi from which we can calculate that Gallio held that office of proconsul from late 51 to the first part of 52. Okay, so now we can date. So we know when Paul is here in front of Gallio in Acts 18:12 that it's either late 51 or 52, early 52. And then we work forward from that to what Paul does and what puts him here in Acts 20 verse, so we can make a real good approximation of when is Paul here. And that winds up being probably in 57, early 57. Now, typically people will say late 56 or early 57. Some will say 55 or 56, and you may get some that would say a year later. But we're right in that window. Okay, and I think 57 is a good approximation or estimate of when Paul is writing this letter. And that date of 57, whether you go 56, 57, that date falls within what's known as the 5-year period of Nero. The 5-year period of Nero. This is the first 5 years of the reign of the Roman Emperor Nero, from 54 to 59. That 5-year period of Nero. Barry Smith, who's a New Testament scholar, he says, this period in Roman history was considered the best period of the Roman Empire since the time of Augustus, unlike the latter part of Nero's reign when the church was persecuted. This may explain why Paul makes no reference to any problems between the Roman believers and civil authorities. So in those first 5 years, Nero had not yet launched on this psychotic persecution of Christians, but his gross immorality was on full display. Okay, here's what these three scholars, Andreas Kostenberger, L. Scott Kellum, and Charles Quarles, in their book, The Cradle, the Cross, and the Crown, it's a New Testament introduction. They say, even early in his reign, however, the emperor was known to practice every kind of obscenity. Suetonius, who's a Roman historian, described in vivid detail Nero's sins with mistresses and prostitutes and his unthinkable perversion. Nero raped one of Rome's Vestal virgins. These were priestesses of the goddess Vesta. He emasculated, castrated, and then publicly wed a boy named Sporus. Rome joked that the world would have been a happier place if Nero's father had married such a wife. Nero had made himself the bride of his freedman Doryphorus. This was Rome's noble leader, and his conduct was undoubtedly a reflection, though perhaps an exaggerated one, of the immoral culture in which he lived. So this is the top guy, and this is what you're getting from him. Now, we don't know when or by whom the church in Rome was founded. Paul has not yet been to Rome when he writes this. He hadn't been there yet. And Peter is very unlikely as the founder there because he's still in Jerusalem at the time of Acts 15, which is in AD 49. And there's evidence that the church was in Rome by that time, by AD 49. And we know that because the Roman Emperor Claudius, he expelled Jews from Rome because of a disruption that was instigated by Chrestus. I'll say more about this in a minute. But this is this notion, see, that the Jews were there and there was infighting. So he expels them over this disruption and rioting over at the instigation of Chrestus, which is almost certainly a Latin misspelling of Christos, Christ. And so there was conflict in the Jewish community over Jesus as the Christ. And this Roman emperor doesn't like it. and he winds up expelling them. So the church is already there in Rome. And in addition, so is Peter doing it? No, Peter's still in Jerusalem. By the time the church is already there. And in addition, it's impossible to think that Paul, who in chapter 15, verse 20, he says that he will not build on another person's foundation, that he would have written this letter, or he would have planned the kind of visit he describes in chapter 1, verse 8 to 15, to a church that had been founded by Peter. Okay, so we don't know. We know the church is there, but we do not know when or by whom the church in Rome was founded. But there's a good idea. Okay, it's certainly debated, but a reasonable scenario for the founding of the church in Rome is that the Jews who were converted on the day of Pentecost in Jerusalem, in Acts chapter 2, that they then brought their faith in Jesus back with them to their home synagogues. And so here they are at Pentecost. They go back to the home synagogues there in Rome, and that squares with the assessment of the 4th century church leader, a man named Ambrosiaster, who wrote that the Romans, quote, have embraced the faith of Christ, albeit according to the Jewish rite, without seeing any sign of mighty works or any of the apostles. You see, and that would be consistent if some Jews had converted and they went back to their synagogues and started teaching about Jesus and gaining converts there. Now, the composition of the church in Rome, there are both Jewish Christians and Gentile elements there in the church in Rome. And it seems likely that the Gentile Christians are in the majority of the church here in Rome. And at least enough so to justify Paul including the Christian community in Rome within the sphere of those Gentiles to whom his apostleship was specifically directed. So I think it's predominantly majority Gentile because Paul takes them in his orbit as one who has this particular assignment to be an apostle to the Gentiles. And you can see that in chapter 1 and chapter 15, that idea of including them within the orbit of his apostolic responsibility. And if you're thinking, you say, well, if Christianity in Rome, this idea that you propose that it was at Pentecost and they brought the faith in Christ back to the synagogues, if it began among Jews, well, how did this shift occur so that now you're saying that it's predominantly Gentile? How would a Christian faith that began among synagogues in Rome lead to a predominantly Gentile congregation? And it may be, we're not told, but it may be what happened is that you had God-fearers. In synagogues you had Gentiles who were interested in Judaism and who attended the synagogues, but they had not converted to Judaism. So there you have a Gentile crop that is there to hear of the teaching about Jesus from these converts who had come. So you would then have Gentiles starting there, and that would have been something. And then this shift in the complexion from Jewish to predominantly Gentile, that would have accelerated by Claudius's expulsion of the Jews from Rome in AD 49. You see, that would have sped that up, that transition. So as I said, that the Roman historian Suetonius, he lives from, say, 69 to 140 AD. Okay, just to set where we are. Paul's writing in, I say, 57. This Roman historian, born 69, dies 140. But he says that he reports that Claudius expelled those Jews from Rome because of their constant rioting at the instigation of Chrestus. And I said most scholars think that Chrestus is a misspelling of Christos, and it's probably a reference to those disputes within the Jewish community over claims that Jesus is the Christ. And that expulsion that you have by Claudius in AD 49, that's referred to in Acts chapter 18, verse 2, where Priscilla and Aquila were expelled from Rome. You see, so they were part of that. And so he's expelling the Jews there. And the Roman authorities, they wouldn't have distinguished between Jews and Jewish Christians, right? You're just Jews. And so you can see how that could change the complexion, because if Jews were, so we have a congregation here that has some Gentiles and some Jews, and now we're kicking the Jews out of Rome. Okay, well, even if not all of them are going, we're not sure how many of them left. But we know Priscilla and Aquila were among those that left. And so you can see, then so you'd be left with what? You'd be left with the Gentile Christians. And so that would then change things. And, so that may be what's in play in trying to think through how could this have happened. Now, as with similar expulsions of specific groups from Rome, this wasn't the only time this happened. There were other groups that had been expelled. This one didn't stay in force very long. In fact, soon after Claudius dies, so he's the one who has it in AD 49. But soon after he dies in AD 54, Jews like Priscilla and Aquila. We know they're back in Rome because Paul greets them in Romans 16. But Jews, after Claudius' death, they returned to Rome. And so Jewish Christians who returned, they may well have found themselves then in a minority. Not all of them would return. The church would have continued to grow among the Gentiles. So here, you're out, you come back, and now you are in a minority. And they were perhaps viewed with some condescension by the now dominant Gentile wing. You see, looking down on them. And you see that in Romans 14, 15, and elsewhere. Now, the general circumstance of the writing is that, as I say, Paul has completed his pioneer missionary work in these eastern provinces. And after delivering the collection, he's going to go take the collection to Jerusalem. He's planning to go to Spain, and he hopes to visit Rome and then continue on his way west, to continue to Spain with their blessing, with their interest, with their support, right? So it's perfectly natural that he would write to the church in Rome, right? Because of what he's planning to do. He's going to stop off there. He wants to have this, be a base of operation as he ministers in Spain. So that's easy to understand. What's harder to understand is why Paul writes to the church in Rome the things that he writes. Okay, that's not easy to understand. How is this content of Romans, which is so deeply theological, how is that related to the purpose of his writing? And there are probably several reasons behind his writing this letter. I think he has, not just one purpose. He has a number of reasons for writing it. And one of them is, I think, the place and the relationship of Jews and Gentiles within Christianity. This was a hot issue. This was a hot issue among Christians outside of Rome. And there's no reason to think that the Christians in Rome would have been isolated from that debate. You see, how do Jewish and Gentile Christians fit together? What is their relationship and how do they work? Paul had battled Judaizers in Galatia and Corinth, and he was concerned when he wrote Romans how the gift from the Gentile churches, how that gift would be received in Jerusalem. You see that in 15:25 to 31. So you see this Jew-Gentile tensions were about. And so Paul is interested, I think, in addressing that. And Paul wanted to secure this missionary base for his work in Spain. So he wanted the Roman Christians to know the truth of the gospel that he preached. If they're going to be with him and behind him and support him, well, he wants them to be on board. He wants, this is what I say and teach, and I want you to have confidence that this is right, so we can all as one be involved in that. For some Jewish Christians, he either needed or thought he needed to correct the false impression that his gospel was anti-law or even anti-Jewish. And at the same time, he needed to change the thinking of some of those Jewish Christians who overemphasized the law. who overemphasized the law and their Jewish prerogatives, and he needed to change the thinking of those Gentiles who tended to scorn everything Jewish. If he's going to bring them together united as support, then he's got some work to do, at least as he sees it. Whatever he's heard, whatever he's thinking, he thinks he needs to deal with some of these issues to help put them on the same page and to resolve problems that are at least anticipated if they're not actually present there. So those Christians, like I said, the Gentiles tended to look down on the Jewish Christian. In other words, that's what he wants to do, unite Jew and Gentile around the truth of the gospel, that they might then as one support his work in Spain. And he was no doubt aware that the church needed these instructions, at least from what he had heard. So the things that he says, he is in his mind, he's saying this is something that's going to be a blessing to them. Now, maybe most importantly, Colin Kruse considers this the most important thing. Paul views the predominantly Gentile Roman church as being among those to whom his apostleship was especially directed. You'll see it in verses in chapter 1, verses in chapter 15. As he says in chapter 15, verses 15 and 16, he writes the things he does because in his role as a minister among the Gentiles, he wants them to be an acceptable offering to God. Meaning, he wants them to be grounded in the truth of the gospel. He wants them to understand, what has God revealed about his work in Jesus Christ? And he wants them to be solid in that. And in their specific context, that required him to address the particular matters about which he wrote, which would also serve his intricacy in securing that missionary base. So all of those things are in play. And they won't answer all of the questions, but I think that framework, as we look and say, why is Paul writing these things? I think that may help us. All right, you didn't think I'd get to the text because you've been in my classes before and you say, if the introduction doesn't go at least 2 classes, then he's had a stroke. No, here we go. Romans chapter 1. Paul, a slave of Christ Jesus, called to be an apostle, having been set apart for the gospel of God, which he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures, concerning his Son, who came from the seed of David according to the flesh, who was appointed Son of God in power according to the Spirit of holiness from the resurrection of the dead, Jesus Christ our Lord. Through him we received grace and apostleship for bringing about the obedience of faith among all the Gentiles, for the sake of his name, among whom you also are, those called to belong to Jesus Christ. To all the beloved of God who are in Rome, those called to be saints, grace and peace to you from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. So Paul, he refers to himself as a slave or a servant of Christ Jesus. See, one who has been specially called by God to serve in the cause of God's gospel. Right? I understand you and I, we all have a role to play, but he is an apostle. He was called specially to play a foundational role in the launching of God's church. Now, he is on a mission from God, like that line from the Blues Brothers, we're on a mission from God. He is on a mission from God. Right? Paul is an apostle who has been chosen, and he's on a mission to proclaim the death and resurrection of Jesus and the consequent amnesty and liberation that men and women may enjoy through faith in Jesus Christ. That's the mission that Paul is on. And this gospel, which concerns God's Son, this was promised in advance through the prophets in the Old Testament. And when he speaks of prophets, the prophets there include men like Moses, people we don't typically think of as prophets. You see in Acts chapter 3, 21 to 23, includes men like David. You see in Acts chapter 2, verse 30, as well as those we would typically classify as prophets. Okay, so he says here that this was promised in advance through the prophets in the Old Testament. You see, in chapter 3, verse 21 of Romans, Paul insists that the law and prophets, all of the Scripture, the law and prophets testify to the righteousness made known through the gospel. So back there, the law and the prophets testify to the righteousness made known through the gospel. In 1626, he says the gospel had been made known through the prophetic scriptures. Okay, so we have this Old Testament base here. There's continuity between the Old Testament and the New Testament. The gospel is foreshadowed in the Old Testament. You see, it is foreshadowed there. It doesn't drop out of nowhere. It has prophetic background and pointing. And when you see it, then you can go back and go, oh yeah. You see? So there it is, and that's what he's talking about. And there's a parallel structure in verses 3 and 4 that sometimes translations obscure it. And in these verses, Paul may be quoting or drawing on an early Christian creed. Okay, a Christian creed is simply a simple way of articulating truths of the gospel that was easily memorable. You see, so there were these kinds of things. And he may be here appealing to such a thing, and he's doing it to summarize the content of the gospel that he just mentioned in verse 1. And here you can see the parallel structure of verses 3 and 4. And so we have the pre-existent Son of God. He doesn't say that here, but that's what Paul understands and Paul means. That's the New Testament truth. The pre-existent Son of God came into human existence in the lineage of the great King David. He's born into the lineage of David. In Romans chapter 15, verse 12, Paul applies to Jesus Isaiah's statement, he will be the shoot of Jesse. So he applies that to him. And in 2 Timothy 2:8, he again describes Jesus as from the seed of David. You see, this is a clear reference to the fact that Jesus is the long-awaited Messiah. You see, this son of David, he's the long-awaited Messiah. The promise to David that his seed would have eternal reign, that you see in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 12 to 16, and also in Psalm 89. That promise became the prime focus of messianic expectation in the Old Testament and in Judaism. You see that idea in Isaiah 11:1, 10, Jeremiah 23, Jeremiah 30, 33, 14 to 18, Ezekiel. You see it there, and you see it in Judaism in John 7:42, Matthew 9:27. See that Jesus was the fulfillment of this promise, that the Messiah as a descendant of David would come, that Jesus is the fulfillment of this promise. It is all over the New Testament. He is the Son of David. Okay, so we have King David, we have a lineage here. We have descendants of David who ascend to the throne, the kingship, but there is the Messiah in this lineage, the ultimate anointed one, the ultimate Son of David. And that's who Jesus is, you see. That's, as I say, that's all over the New Testament. You see in Matthew 1, 1 to 16, Luke 1:27, 1:32, 1:69, 2 Timothy 2:8, Revelation 5:5, Revelation 22:16. He is that Son of David, that long-awaited Messiah. Now, as an aside, the fact that some who were not in David's line, they were not descendants of David, the fact that they temporarily ruled Israel, that is not contrary to the promise to David that was made in 2 Samuel chapter 7 and Psalm 89, because those texts make clear that the promise contained a punitive clause. It contained a punitive clause. If David's children rebelled against God, they would be punished. They would be punished, and this punishment could result in a temporary Davidic vacancy, but the right to rule, the entitlement to the throne, would always remain with David's line. I mean, God cannot be clearer when he just goes in Psalm 89 saying that's right. That's his line. And that was the promise that was made to David. So the eternal Son of God, here we see Jesus the Christ, he was appointed, who was appointed Son of God. That word appointed, that's the same word that's translated appointed in Acts chapter 10, verse 42, Acts chapter 17, verse 31. He was appointed Son of God in power from the resurrection. He was appointed Son of God in power from the resurrection, meaning at the time of or on the basis of the resurrection. That's when he's appointed Son of God in power. In other words, before the resurrection. He's the Son of God in the weakness and lowliness of his earthly existence. And Paul said the same thing. When Paul goes into the synagogue in Pisidian Antioch in Acts chapter 13, he says the same thing there. When he applies there, he applies the statement in Psalm chapter 2, verse 7. He applies it, "You are my son, today I have begotten you," to God's raising Jesus from the dead. You see, he puts those two together. That point there, "Today I have begotten you." When he says here, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." And he ties that, you see, to his raising Jesus from the dead. Psalm 2, you may know. Psalm 2 speaks of the nation's rebellion against God and against his anointed king of Israel. So the nations are rebelling there, and they rebel in vain because God, the heavenly king, he has placed his king on the throne in Jerusalem, and he will provide him dominion over the other nations. So he laughs. You know, that's my man there. I've installed that king. And so you think you're going to sit here and you're going to do nothing. You see, he's installed his king on that throne. As Tremper Longman points out in his commentary on Psalms, he says, this psalm, Psalm 2, almost certainly was used during the monarchical period as a song that accompanied the installation ceremony of the son of David who assumed the throne after the death of his father. So we have this long lineage of Davidic kings in Jerusalem. And when one dies and the next one succeeds him, he is then enthroned. He is formally given the rulership. Right? He's formally given that rulership. And this psalm, where it sits here, this Psalm 2, when he says here, "You are my son, today I have begotten you," that would be sung during that enthronement ceremony. And in the first century, that psalm was widely understood to include a reference to the Messiah. You see, the ultimate Davidic king, right? We've got Davidic kings, sons of David, but we're looking out and there's going to be the ultimate son of David, the Messiah. You see, and it was widely understood, that psalm was understood to include a reference to that ultimate Davidic king, that ultimate anointed one. It was interpreted that way. Psalm 2 was interpreted that way by the rabbis. It was interpreted that way by the community in Qumran. So this was something that was understood. And so it was understood to have this end time, this eschatological element, the Messiah being a figure who's tied to the end time. So Psalm 2, verses 6 and 7, it makes clear that God's becoming the Father. Okay, this metaphorical begetting of him. That God's becoming the Father refers to the king's enthronement. That's when this was understood to take place. That was when God begot the king. It is when he was enthroned in his formal public identification as Israel's king. He becomes God's son at that time, in the sense he at that time assumes in a public way the new God-appointed role of ruler. So in the language and the concept of Psalm 2:7, being enthroned and formally appointed to the rulership is to be begotten as God's son. That's when that would occur, and that's what Paul is indicating in Acts chapter 13 there. So though Jesus is of course the unique Son of God from his divine conception. Right? There's no question about that. When you look at Gabriel's words to Mary in Luke 1:35, you see the announcement at Jesus' baptism in Luke 3:22. But in his resurrection and in his associated ascension back to heaven as the God-man Jesus, he assumed in a public way. He assumed in a public way the new God-appointed role of Israel's ultimate king, the supremely powerful Lord of Lords. You see, God at that time exalted Jesus to a new stage or a new phase of his messianic career. As God became the father of merely human kings of Israel upon their enthronement, he, in an analogous way, or a sense, became Jesus' father upon his enthronement, upon his public exaltation to ultimate kingship in his resurrection and ascension. Now that doesn't mean that he was not Jesus' father before that time in a different sense. Of course it doesn't mean that. It means only that he became his father at that time in the Psalm chapter 2 verse 7 sense. You see, the way he begot these kings at their enthronement. In that sense, he became his father at his enthronement, his resurrection, and his exaltation. And so there's an awful lot going on here, and this is indicated also, and you see in Philippians 2, 5-11, right? Where he says there that Jesus, the Son, chose to forego certain prerogatives of his divinity in obedience to the will of the Father, only to have bestowed on him, through his faithfulness, the supremely powerful position of Lord of Lords. You see, with the resurrection, he entered into this new state or new phase of his messianic career. He was in this new exalted position. He says he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on the cross. Therefore, God exalted him. You see, so there's this change. Let me read you Witherington's quote. I heard that bell, but let me get this in because you'd be scratching your head more if I don't. Ben Witherington, in his commentary, he says, verse 4 is not about what Christ is according to his divine nature, but rather about what happened to Jesus at the resurrection when God's Spirit raised him from the dead and designated or marked him out as Son of God in power. Paul means here that at the resurrection, Jesus enters a phase of his career where he becomes Son of God in power. Previously, he was Son of God in weakness. He did not assume the role of glorified and exalted and all-powerful Lord until after the resurrection. So Philippians chapter 2, when he was appointed to such a role. You see, this idea of his enthronement as the Messiah, as Israel's ultimate king. As you had that happen there, it happened with Jesus in his resurrection and exaltation. He has been enthroned then as the Messiah. Okay, so much more to say, but the bell's killing me.